you need to look back probably into the 7 Years' War to really understand what that relationship's like. Washington becomes a symbol of American resistance. It lasts 8 years because of these difficulties of achieving what the different sides want to achieve. Hello everybody, I'm Saul. I studied history, politics, bit of philosophy. My PhD was at Cambridge. I looked at particularly the 18th century, so this fits in quite nicely. What did the United States look like in the years before the War of Independence? So I think for this question, it sort of depends exactly where we're talking about, because it's still quite a big place. It's 13 colonies, which will become the first 13 states. So not quite the same size as what it is today, but it's still a big place, and it varies quite a bit from where one goes to another place. So you have cities that are starting to grow to reasonable sizes, like New York and Philadelphia. You have trade that is going on between there and Europe and the Caribbean. But then you've also got quite a lot of agricultural areas in the US, particularly in the south and sort of the central parts that aren't quite on the coast. So I'd say, what does it look like? Well, politically, it's fairly split between these 13 colonies, which generally have quite a strong degree of independence and don't even necessarily see themselves as part of the same entity as the other colonies. But then you've also got a lot of agriculture and trade, and then you've also even got religious dissidents, people that came to the New World, to the US, because it was more free. People weren't obligated to follow specific religions. So I'd say, in a nutshell, it's a fairly divided area with a lot of different aspects which sort of make up what these 13 colonies look like. What were the events which led up to the war? We have to kind of decide, whenever we have a big historical question like that, how far we're going to go back in time to figure out the answer to that. And I think to give a comprehensive answer, we have to look back to the Treaty of Paris in 1763. It's a little bit confusing. There's two treaties of Paris, one in 1763, one in 1783, that confirms the creation of the US. But in 1763, the British are at war with the French, and the Americans, obviously as a British colony at the time, are part of that war against the French. And after the war, Canada is signed over to the British. It's conquered in 1759. And that changes a little bit. So on the first hand, what you've got is the removal of French pressure against the American colonies. So the French who were in Canada can't threaten the 13 colonies anymore. But what you also have is the British spend a huge amount of money throughout this war, which is known in England as the 7 Years' War. In the US, it's called the French and Indian War. And because of this huge amount of money that they've spent, they begin to start pushing up taxation on the American colonies, and they're not very happy in general about that. And for example, the most famous one is known as the Stamp Act, which is put in place in 1765, which sounds like a funny thing, Stamp Act. What it means is that any US legal document and newspapers and things like that were published had to have a special British stamp put on it that needed to be paid for. So it was a way of taxing all of these documents. And then this sort of leads to further tensions, which then results in, what one of the famous events is the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, almost certainly overstated with how important it was and whether it was actually an act of independence. It was actually possibly just smugglers that weren't very happy with what the British were doing. But then there's a response by the British after that to end self-rule in Massachusetts. And then by that point, the war is pretty much guaranteed that it's going to break out, and it's going to be serious as well. So I'd say you need to look back probably into the 7 Years' War to really understand what that relationship's like, why are the Americans feeling like they shouldn't be paying their taxes that the British are trying to put on them. There's also this element, of the French no longer threatening the American colonists. The British also, I haven't mentioned this, but it's also important, the British make quite a strict rule that the American colonists are not allowed to go too far west. And the American colonies are not very happy about that. They want to keep expanding. They want to go from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. The British say, actually, we're going to just pen you in mostly on the Rockies, the Ohio Valley. They're not going to be allowing American colonists to cross there, but the American colonists want to. What did the United States Army actually look like prior to 1775? 1775 is a day to choose, with the start really of the Revolutionary War, and then the US Continental Army is founded in June of that year. And prior to that, there is no such thing as a US Army. The US, or the American colonies, the 13 colonies, are part of the British Empire. They're part of Britain. Even using the word empire is slightly contentious at this point. It's not actually how the British generally refer to themselves. But they don't have an army. What they do have is they have militia forces, and these existed in the 13 colonies, but also in Britain and in France and in Spain. And effectively, this was an age before police officers. So if things got really out of hand, what the governments would do is call up their militia and use those as kind of a proto-police force that generally was less effective than modern police forces. They were often more violent because these were soldiers who weren't necessarily trained in how to deal with criminals, but it was a way to, tackle criminal elements. So every state had its own militia. They were able to raise troops. There were sort of provincial troops they were able to put together, which had helped the British in previous conflict. But really, after the Boston Tea Party, so from sort of beginning of 1774 onwards, it becomes sort of pretty clear that war is on the horizon. If it doesn't happen, it's pretty likely to happen. And for some, it's more of a question of when rather than if. And then the training of these militias really takes a step up. And you see the American colonies getting these troops ready so that once war happens in 1775, there's going to be a proper backbone of an army. Even though the initial army actually is not particularly effective, they're still starting to put something together. So before 1775, there isn't an army, these different militia groups, some experience fighting the French in the French and Indian War, but, some experience fighting Native Americans as well, but it's really not much of an army in the same scale as what European forces have at the time.
Hi everyone! Hope you've been enjoying the video so far. If you'd like to see more content like this, or perhaps ask one of our experts a question, make sure to visit our website, questiony.com. Now, back to the video.
What role did George Washington play during the War of Independence? So the most obvious answer to this question is Washington is the commander-in-chief of the American forces. He's appointed to lead the US Army in June of 1775, the beginning of the Second Continental Congress, which is sitting in Philadelphia. And really from then on, he is in charge. He runs the American forces until the end of the conflict. But he's also very good at being sort of a symbol of the cause. He's seen as this patriotic leader. He's good at training soldiers. He's sometimes successful, particularly towards the end. I mean, he captures Boston at the beginning, which is quite useful for the cause. And then there's a moment, and it's sort of captured in American myth in the Christmas Day in 1776. After being in New York, he's driven out of New York in the Battle of Long Island, and then he ends up going over the Delaware, and then he crosses back on Christmas Day of 1776. And it's really captured in this mythologized way, and the way it's painted and talked about. Washington becomes a symbol of American resistance. And he's not just the commander-in-chief; he's also the founding father. And he's this statement of desire from the Americans to become an independent country. Though, I mean, I'm sort of saying that it's estimated that something like half of the American population at the time didn't actually want to be independent. But for those that do, Washington does have this status. He also quells mutinies in the army. He resists attempts to have himself removed. And what he's also very good at is constantly requesting supplies off Congress. One of the big problems that the US forces have is that they don't really have the supplies to keep fighting and to launch the campaigns that they need to. But Washington is always in contact with them saying, you need to give me this food, you need to give me these bullets, otherwise we're not going to be able to carry on fighting. So yeah, commander-in-chief symbol, and also he's good at doing the political work that means that the army can carry on doing its job. Why did France choose to help the US in its battle for independence against the British? The French help, particularly towards the end of the war, with the supplying of the US army and also blocking off supplies that the British are sending over to supply their forces in this North American theatre. Again, as we said before, what we need to do is run the clock back, so 15 years, 20 years, from the 1770s back to the end of the 1750s and beginning of the 1760s. And I think it really comes down to, and I sort of talk about the French Prime Minister at the time, who is a man called the Duc de Choiseul. Choiseul is a fascinating figure in his own right, but most historians agree that as the Prime Minister of France during a war which France loses to the British, he's constantly looking for an opportunity to get back at the British. And as soon as the war ends, he starts investing money, and the French are nearing bankruptcy as well. So it's really a dire situation. But Choiseul puts it at the highest priority to start investing in the French Navy to get back at the British. They're humiliated. They've lost their colonies in North America, although Choiseul was probably quite happy about that. Again, a separate conversation for another time. They've lost their colonies in India. They've lost their influence in parts of Africa. And it's a real blow for French prestige. There's a quote from one of the French sort of diplomats at the time who sort of says, the power of France has been shattered, and by that war. So it's really the French help the US because it's a way to get back at the British. If they lose parts of their empire, it's going to weaken them, and it's a way of getting revenge really against their opponents that have kind of bested them in the last couple of wars. How actively involved was George III during the American Revolutionary War? So I think it's funny when we talk about the American Revolutionary War, because I feel like for many people it's all about Hamilton and the musical that came out, which has taught people lots about the Revolutionary War. And in some ways it's actually quite accurate. But I think what it does touch on too that maybe needs stressing a bit more is that George III, unfortunately, was not a very well man. And he has his first major breakdown towards the end of the war, where he's basically completely incapacitated. But I think that you can see some of the early signs of his eventual mental breakdown and his illness, even when he's a younger man. And he's described in some letters by one of his tutors that his favorite pastime as a young man was just to sit and stare into space for hours and hours and hours. And he could do that and be very entertained by literally doing absolutely nothing. So I think how actively involved was George III? Well, he wasn't particularly actively involved. He stopped being really actively involved in politics in the 1760s. But he definitely wants the rebellion quashed. He does not like the idea that some of his subjects would want to revolt against him and stop being his subjects. He has a good relationship with the Prime Minister at the time, Lord North, and he's asking Lord North regularly for updates. He's trying to help him make a concerted war policy and keep the cabinet on side. So yes, George III does not make policy, he does not suggest policy, but he's definitely involved with making sure that his country, the government, is putting their efforts together to quash and defeat the American revolutionaries. But I will say, I think we always have to take George III and questions about him with a little bit of a pinch of salt, just because he's very much not a well man, unfortunately. Did the US Continental Army have any significant naval support to fight the British? So the Navy, the US Navy, is initially very small in a military sense, but it's actually not that small in terms of merchant shipping. So again, I mentioned before that you've got a variety of things going on in the US colonies and the 13 colonies prior to independence. And one of them is trade. So you have these trade ships which are coming out of, the northern parts like Boston and New York, and they come down into the Caribbean. Some of them are going into Europe. Some of them go up the coast along North America into Canada. So there's quite a big merchant fleet, but there's not really much of a naval, military presence. And the US have in 1776 27 warships. The British have 10 times that number. So at the beginning, there's not a lot of significant naval support. There are some early successes as an American attack on the Bahamas in February of 1776 with ships and marines, which is quite successful. Then later on in the war, this balance where the British have a bigger fleet is offset by the Spanish and the French getting involved. It's mostly not that helpful for what the Americans are doing on a day-to-day basis in North America, except that it ties down a lot of British ships. So the British can't just send all their navy across to North America because they're also trying to worry about what the French and the Spanish are doing with their fleets in Europe. But then it is helpful right at the end. General Cornwallis is in Yorktown, and he's trying to get more supplies, and the French fleet is stopping those supplies from happening, and also drops off some French soldiers, which contributes to Cornwallis's surrender in 1782, which is basically the conclusion of the war. That's the last major siege that happens, and from then the main British forces are expelled or surrender to the Americans. What was the size of the British army involved in the US War of Independence? Questions about army sizes, it's funny, you'd think that it would be something that's kind of really easy to give numbers to. But we kind of see this problem even with, British armies, French armies that you'd think you'd have really, really good numbers for. That the numbers seem to conflict with each other, and some big battles we don't really know exactly how many soldiers are on either side. And that's partly because soldiers are forced into the army and they don't really want to be there, so they run away. But at least 50,000 soldiers fight in the British army against the US. There's attempts by the British to impress people into fighting, to take people that were unemployed and then send them off into the army. It doesn't go well at all. And they resort really to hiring German mercenaries, and these were known as Hessians. It's sort of quite well-known, these Hessians. It's named after an area of Germany called Hesse-Cassel, but actually most of the Germans, or many of them, are not actually from this part of Germany. That's just what they're called. They're called Hessians after this one area where many mercenaries came from, but certainly not all of them. And there's at least somewhere around 30,000 Germans that fight for the British Army during the Revolutionary War. And there's probably somewhere in the region of 20,000, maybe a little bit more, American loyalists that serve in the army as well. So it's quite a mixed batch of people. But yeah, I'd say the numbers are probably somewhere around there. Why did the war last over 8 years? It's often, again, quite a typical thing with military campaigns, that they never last as long or as short probably as leaders expect them to last. And it's military theory terms, it's often called after the Prussian German military theorist called Karl von Clausewitz, that talks about the friction of war, and as soon as people have an idea of what war's going to happen, it never resolves itself in that way because of the friction of the different armies and supplying and all the things that have to go into war. So it's partly just that. It's just military friction. People don't achieve what they want to achieve as soon as they want to achieve it. And I think, for the US Army, the Continental Army, there's a few things to point at for them why they're not successful quicker. 50% of the population, as I mentioned before, doesn't support the Declaration of Independence. That number goes down, particularly as there's reports of British atrocities and violence against people there. But there's still a sizable population of people that are not interested in becoming independent. And you actually see quite a few of these people moving after the War of Independence up to Canada because they want to remain part of the British Empire. And the war as well has ups and downs. Initially, Washington takes Boston, but he comes back to New York. He's not successful. His first attempt to take New York ends up going back to Philadelphia. There's a huge shortage of provisions throughout the war. I mean, you can read Washington's requests to Congress in 1776 and in the 1781, 1782 campaigns. He's still requesting supplies. He's struggling to get his army moving. I mean, the country, as I said as well before, it's big. Transport links are not great. It takes a while to get anywhere. It takes a while to move supplies. The Americans as well, they don't control the sea in a significant way, so they can't really transport that many supplies by sea. And it lasts 8 years because of these difficulties of achieving what the different sides want to achieve. And then the British as well, they're fighting a war which is over the Atlantic Ocean. So to send orders there is a really difficult thing to do, and to get more soldiers there and to get more supplies there, it's hard. And it's just, I think there's an accumulation of these factors which mean that neither side can kind of get the knockout blow. So the British can't destroy the Continental Army and crush Congress, but at the same time, the Continental Army can't just drive out the British quickly, because that there's difficulties with getting soldiers together and getting them to inflict the damage and win the victories that they need them to win. Why did George Washington only become president in 1789, 6 years after the US War of Independence ended? So when the war ends, Washington goes home to Mount Vernon, and there's rebellions in the country, such as Shays' Rebellion, which is partly over taxation. And the US is trying to figure out how the country is going to be run. There's not a very clear idea to do that. There are the Declaration of Independence, and there's these Articles of Confederation, but they're not really strong enough to run a country. There's also a big rivalry going on, particularly between Jefferson and Hamilton. Again, figuring out the relationship between the US states and the US federal government. So I would suggest the main reason why it takes a long time to go from the defeat of the British to Washington actually becoming president is because they're trying to figure out, how is the country going to exist? What's the responsibilities going to be of the government? And they wait until the Constitution is ratified, which happens at the end of 1787, to then have a vote to then elect the president. And they actually do sort of agree, and Washington's in favor of this, that they're going to have less powerful states and more authority for the federal government.